Elias Vane adjusted the thrusters of his battered salvage ship, the Wayfinder, as it drifted into dock at Station Polaris 9. The hum of aging engines echoed through the empty halls of the vessel, a familiar sound in the otherwise deafening silence of deep space. He exhaled sharply, rubbing the ache in his shoulder, a permanent souvenir from the war. Life on a forgotten salvage ship wasn't glamorous, but it was peaceful. Mostly. He stared at the worn datapad in his hand, the contract blinking back at him. Personal maintenance assistant contract accepted. Syra, Zen 3 empathic species. He frowned. He didn't like working with others, but he couldn't maintain the ship alone anymore. A lifetime of isolation and hard labor had taken its toll. Against his better judgment, he'd agreed to hire help. The docking bay hissed open with a hydraulic groan, and there she stood. Zyra was smaller than he expected, wrapped in a fitted cloak of soft gray fabric that shimmered faintly under the station's cold lighting. Her skin was pale with an almost luminous undertone, faint lines of bioluminescent markings tracing along her neck and wrists, flickering faintly like a heartbeat. Her large, reflective eyes shimmered with faint curiosity but held no fear. Captain Vane. Her voice was soft but steady, carrying an unfamiliar melodic accent. That's me. His voice came out rougher than intended. He extended a calloused hand. Welcome aboard the Wayfinder. Zyra hesitated only for a breath before taking his hand. Her fingers were impossibly warm, her touch sending a tingling sensation up his arm. He stiffened but didn't let go. For a fleeting second, he could have sworn his pulse synced with the soft glow of her markings, but the sensation vanished as quickly as it came. Thank you for this opportunity, she said, withdrawing her hand gracefully. Don't thank me yet, he muttered. The ship's falling apart. He led her through the narrow, dimly lit corridors of the ship. The faint smell of metal and engine oil lingered in the air. Zyra's gaze swept across every surface, taking in the worn consoles, exposed wiring, and patched walls. It wasn't much, but it was home, at least to him. This will be your quarters. He pushed open a metal door, revealing a small but tidy room with a narrow bunk and a storage locker. Basic amenities. No laxity. We work for what we need. She nodded, stepping inside. I'm used to simple conditions. Her voice softened, almost wistful. He cleared his throat. Good. We start at 0600. He turned to leave but paused. You, glow sometimes. What's that about? Her gaze dropped. It's a reflex. Emotional feedback. I'll keep it under control. Do that, he said, more brusquely than intended, then left before she could read too much into his lingering stare. The first week passed in strained silence. Zyra worked efficiently, repairing what she could and assisting with routine salvage missions. She kept her distance, respectful but always observant. Elias couldn't help noticing the subtle flickers of light tracing her skin when she thought no one was watching. Soft pulses responding to something. He didn't ask. He didn't want to know. Then came the storm. It hit suddenly, a surge of cosmic radiation ripping through the outer hull while they worked in the cargo bay. Warning sirens howled as the lights flickered and died, plunging the ship into darkness. Power grids hit. Elias cursed, yanking open a panel as sparks showered over them. We need to reset the manual relays. Before he could act, another blast rocked the ship, throwing him against the wall. He groaned, feeling a sharp jolt of pain in his ribs. Captain. Zyra was at his side in an instant, her fingertips brushing his temple, leaving a trail of warmth. Her touch sent a strange pulse through him. Not unpleasant, just grounding. I'm fine, he snapped, forcing himself upright. Get to the relay station. Now. They stumbled through the dark corridors, guided only by emergency lighting. Every breath felt heavier as the ship's life support faltered. When they finally reached the relay station, the control panel was dead. It's fried. Elias slammed his fist against the console. Zyra's breathing quickened as she placed trembling hands on the cold metal. There might be another way. Her bioluminescent markings began to glow brighter, casting ethereal blue light across the confined space. "What the hell are you doing?" Elias hissed, heart pounding. "Trust me." Her eyes locked onto his, intense and unwavering. "Just hold still." Before he could argue, her fingers brushed his cheek, trailing warmth and light. He froze, the electric sensation rushing through his skin like liquid fire. The ship around them seemed to fade as her touch deepened, impossibly tender, achingly intimate. "Breathe," she whispered, her glowing fingertips tracing his jaw. "Let me feel." He should have pushed her away, should have resisted, but her touch wasn't just physical. It reached deeper, soothing old wounds he hadn't realized still ached. Memories flickered at the edge of his mind. The cold void of space, the sharp sting of loss, the hollow ache of being utterly alone. And then warmth, connection. The console behind them sparked to life with a surge of energy, bathing the room in harsh white light. Zyra gasped, stumbling back as her glow dimmed to a soft shimmer. For a long moment, neither spoke. "You fixed it," Elias managed, breathless. She nodded faintly, still trembling. "Your emotions, they were strong. I couldn't ignore them." His jaw tightened, still reeling from the intensity of what had just happened. He wasn't sure if he wanted to demand answers or reach for her again, but the ship stabilizers kicked in, breaking the moment. "Get some rest," he muttered, turning away before she could see the conflict in his eyes. "We'll talk later." As he walked back through the darkened corridors, he could still feel the lingering warmth of her touch burning against his skin, and something far deeper awakening inside him. The ship's engines hummed steadily as the Wayfinder sailed through the desolate reaches of uncharted space. Repairs from the radiation storm had held, thanks to Zyra's unexpected intervention. Elias had avoided discussing what happened in the relay room, though the memory clung to him like static. Her touch, the warmth, the way his emotions had poured into her like water breaching a dam. Zyra kept her distance after that night, speaking only when necessary. Her glow dimmed to faint, flickering traces, as if she were deliberately suppressing it. Elias didn't press the issue, he couldn't. Every time he thought of her trembling fingers tracing his skin, his chest tightened with something uncomfortably close to longing. One evening, after a particularly grueling salvage run, he found her in the ship's observation bay. She stood with her back to him, gazing out at the swirling nebulae beyond the reinforced window. The soft, bioluminescent lines along her arms shimmered faintly, responding to something he couldn't see. "You should be resting," he said gruffly, stepping into the room. Zyra didn't turn around. "I couldn't sleep." Her voice was quiet, carrying a weight he couldn't ignore. For a moment, he considered leaving, letting her work through whatever was bothering her. But something about her stillness rooted him in place. He cleared his throat. "You did good out there. I didn't thank you properly." She finally turned, her luminous eyes reflecting the distant stars. "It's my duty to help. You don't need to thank me." Elias crossed his arms. "It wasn't just duty. You saved the ship and me." Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken things. Her fingers twitched at her sides, the faint glow along her wrists intensifying for just a moment before dimming again. "Why do you hide it?" he asked subtly, surprising even himself. Her gaze lowered. "The glow is personal. It reveals too much. You think I can't handle it?" His voice softened, rough but genuine. Her breath hitched. "I think it would be too much for both of us." He took a step closer, closing the distance between them. "I'm not afraid of what I see." Her eyes widened, shimmering brighter as her markings flared softly along her collarbones. She held still as if caught between retreating and leaning in. The air felt charged, pulsing between them like the silent hum of the ship's core. "I feel more than I should," she admitted, her voice trembling. "When we were trapped, couldn't block it out. I felt everything you felt. Your fear, your pain, and something else." He swallowed hard. "What else?" Zyra's gaze met his, vulnerable yet intense. "Loneliness. a need to be close. His breath stalled, memories flashing through his mind. Nights spent alone in cold quarters. The weight of solitude pressing in like the endless dark outside the ship. He had lived with it so long he had forgotten what connection felt like, until her touch. "You think you're the only one who feels that?" His voice dropped, rough with suppressed emotion. Her fingers twitched again, as if fighting the urge to reach for him. This time he closed the space between them, carefully lifting her hand in his. Her skin was impossibly soft, thrumming with warmth like a heartbeat beneath his calloused palm. "You don't have to hold back," tentatively, he whispered. She let her fingers lace through his, her glow intensifying in a slow, pulsing rhythm. The sensation washed over him, warm, steady, grounding. His chest tightened, not from discomfort, but from something far more profound. Zyra shivered under his touch, her breath unsteady. "If I let go, I'm afraid you'll see too much." "Show me," he urged, his voice low but steady. "I'm still here." Her luminous gaze searched his face, looking for hesitation or doubt, but found none. With a shaky breath, she lifted her free hand and gently rested it against his chest. Her glowing fingertips traced slow, deliberate patterns along the worn fabric of his shirt, each touch sending tingling warmth through his skin. His eyes fluttered closed as the ship around them seemed to vanish, replaced by a sensation deeper than touch, an electric pulse of shared emotions threading between them. He felt her loneliness, her unspoken desire to belong, and her growing need for something more than duty. His hands moved on their own, sliding gently up her arms, feeling the soft hum of energy beneath her skin. She gasped softly but didn't pull away, leaning into his touch with a quiet, desperate intensity. "You're warm," she whispered, her voice trembling with something between wonder and relief. "So are you," he murmured, brushing a thumb across her wrist where her pulse flickered brightest. Their foreheads rested together, breath mingling as the charged stillness deepened. His hand gently cupped her jaw, tilting her face just enough that their lips hovered dangerously close. But he held back, unwilling to break the fragile moment without her permission. Zyra's luminous eyes searched his one last time before she closed the distance, pressing her lips softly to his. The kiss was tentative at first, uncertain, searching, but quickly deepened into something far more intense. Her hands curled into his shirt as she melted into him, her markings flaring brighter with every pulse of emotion passing between them. His arms circled her, holding her firmly but gently, grounding her even as her touch ignited something he hadn't felt in years, something he never thought he'd feel again. When they finally broke apart, breathless and trembling, she rested her forehead against his, eyes still shimmering with residual light. "I've never done that before," she admitted softly. He brushed a stray lock of hair from her cheek, his hand lingering. "Neither have I. Not like that." The ship's low hum slowly crept back into awareness, grounding them once more in reality. Neither moved, unwilling to break the fragile connection still thrumming between them. Zyra's fingers tightened briefly against his chest, as if holding onto the moment a second longer. "What happens now?" Elias exhaled, still catching his breath. "We figure it out. Together." For the first time, her lips curved into a faint, genuine smile. The glow of her markings softened, warm and steady, matching the quiet, resolute beat of his heart. Elias couldn't stop thinking about the way Zyra's fingers had felt against his skin, warm and electric, her touch searing deeper than any memory he thought he'd buried. Days passed, but the charged intensity of that shared moment lingered in the air, thick and unyielding. Neither of them spoke of it, but the distance they once maintained was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous. Routine tasks on the Wayfinder continued as usual. The ship needed constant upkeep, and with the recent damage from the radiation storm, there was no shortage of repairs. Still, every time they worked together in the cramped corridors, Elias felt her presence as keenly as if she were touching him again. His hands would brush hers while passing tools, sparking tiny, electric reminders of the night they shared. Each moment felt suspended, stretched taut with unresolved tension. Late one evening, while inspecting the outer hull for stress fractures, Elias noticed the temperature readings fluctuating in the ship's engine bay. The diagnostic scanner flickered with an unusual spike in the coolant system. He cursed under his breath. If the core overheated, they'd lose power entirely. Grabbing his toolkit, he made his way to the maintenance bay, only to find Zyra already there, crouched near the coolant regulators. The soft blue glow of her bioluminescent markings lit the darkened bay like a constellation of stars. She was focused, her delicate fingers working swiftly over tangled wires as the cooling unit hissed with escaping vapor. "You should have called me," Elias said, stepping closer. Zyra startled, nearly dropping her tool. The alarms were inconsistent. "I didn't want to wake you." He knelt beside her, examining the faulty connection. "You shouldn't handle something this dangerous alone." Her gaze softened, lingering on him longer than necessary. "I'm not alone now." His chest tightened at her quiet admission. He reached past her to inspect the coolant regulator, their shoulders brushing. Her skin was impossibly warm against his, sending another familiar pulse through him. He let his fingers linger a moment longer than necessary before forcing himself to focus on the task. "We need to reset the thermal gauge manually," he muttered, his voice rougher than intended. "The main control console's offline." Zyra nodded, her markings flaring softly. "I can rear out the power flow if you guide the system reset." They worked in unspoken rhythm, navigating the tight, confined space as the ship groaned softly around them. Sweat beaded on Elias's brow as he adjusted the coolant flow, straining to secure the damaged lines. Zyra pressed against his side to steady him, her touch grounding him in a way nothing else ever could. Just as they finished the last calibration, the coolant system roared back to life with a powerful surge, sending a blast of chilled air through the bay. Elias stumbled back, his breath fogging in the sudden cold. Before he could react, Zyra grabbed his arm, steadying him as they both shivered. "Your hand's freezing," she whispered, clasping his fingers between hers. Her glow intensified, radiant warmth pouring from her palms like living fire. "I'm fine," he rasped, though he made no move to pull away. Zyra's grip tightened, her expression softening with quiet determination. "Let me help, please." Before he could respond, she guided his trembling hands to her face, pressing his calloused fingers gently against her glowing skin. Her warmth seeped into him instantly, soothing the sharp ache in his chilled joints. He exhaled slowly, letting himself lean into her touch. "You don't have to keep pretending you don't need anyone," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. His throat tightened as his fingers traced the soft curve of her cheek, marveling at the way her markings pulsed brighter beneath his touch. He couldn't remember the last time someone had held him like this, with such quiet intensity, no demand, no expectation, just connection. "I'm not used to this," he admitted hoarsely, his thumb brushing the edge of her jaw. "Letting someone in." Zyra's luminous eyes met his, steady and unyielding. "Neither am I." The ship's distant hum faded into nothing as Elias slowly lowered his forehead to hers, their breaths mingling in the cold, shared air. Her fingers curled into the front of his shirt, anchoring herself to him as his arms circled her waist, pulling her closer with a quiet, desperate need he could no longer suppress. Their lips met in a slow, searching kiss, tentative at first, but deepening with every passing second. Her glow surged with vibrant light, casting shimmering patterns across the darkened bay as her emotions spilled through every gentle press of her mouth against his. Elias groaned softly, tightening his hold as their kiss deepened, raw and unspoken feelings igniting like distant stars colliding in the void. When they finally pulled apart, breathless and trembling, Zyra's glowing markings still pulsed steadily, her eyes searching his with quiet vulnerability. "I don't want this to end," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Elias rested his forehead against hers again, his breathing still uneven. "It doesn't have to." They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's warmth, safe from the cold expanse of space beyond the ship's walls. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Elias didn't feel alone. The ache of solitude that had haunted him for years had finally faded, replaced by something far more profound, far more dangerous, but something he could no longer deny. The ship's power stabilizers hummed faintly in the background, grounding them both in the fragile, shared moment they had fought so hard to resist. Neither spoke, but words were unnecessary. Everything that mattered had already been said in the way they held on to each other, unwilling to let go. And for the first time, Elias Vane let himself hope. The Wayfinder drifted through the cold expanse of uncharted space, its repaired systems humming steadily after the coolant crisis. Inside, the air was quiet but charged, heavy with things left unsaid. Ever since that night in the maintenance bay, Elias and Zyra had fallen into an unspoken rhythm, balancing their tasks with an intimacy that neither dared to name. Elias found himself watching her more often than he should. Her graceful movements, the way her bioluminescent markings pulsed faintly when she was focused. It all drew his attention in ways he couldn't control. She moved through the ship like she belonged there, her presence softening edges of the solitude he'd once clung to. But connection came. Elias was adjusting the Wayfinder's navigation system when the ship's proximity alarms blared to life. His head snapped up, heart pounding as he rushed to the cockpit, where Zyra was already at the controls. "Status report," he barked, slipping into the pilot's seat beside her. "Unidentified vessel on approach," Zyra answered, her voice tense but steady. "They're running silent. No transponder signal." "Pirates. They had to be." Elias cursed under his breath and activated the ship's limited defense systems. The external cameras displayed a dark, angular starship looming just beyond sensor range, predatory and unmistakably hostile. "They're locking weapons," Zyra warned, her bioluminescent skin dimming with fear. Before she could finish, a blast rocked the Wayfinder, sending them both sprawling against the control consoles. Sparks rained down as the ship groaned under the impact. "The evasive maneuvers," Elias barked, grabbing the flight stick and pulling hard to the left. The ship twisted sharply, narrowly dodging another searing plasma bolt. "Divert all power to shields." Zyra's fingers flew across the console, rerouting power as ordered. Her glowing markings flared brighter with concentration as she fought to keep the ship's systems online. Another blast hit, harder this time, and the lights flickered ominously. "We can't take another hit like that," she gasped. Elias's mind raced. Outgunned and outmaneuvered, there was no way they could survive a prolonged firefight. "Unless there's a debris field just past Grid 12, he said grimly, plotting a desperate course. "We'll use it for cover. But, trust me." His voice was steady, but his hand trembled as he pushed the ship's engines to maximum burn. The Wayfinder roared toward the debris field, weaving through shattered remnants of long-abandoned starships. Plasma bolts streaked past them, searing dangerously close. Zyra clutched the co-pilot's controls, her markings pulsing with heightened intensity. Suddenly, the ship bucked violently as something sharp tore through the rear stabilizers. Warning sirens blared. "We lost the aft engine," Zyra cried. "We're losing control." Elias's jaw clenched as he fought to steady the ship, knowing they couldn't take much more. His gaze flicked to Zyra, her luminous eyes wide with determination despite the fear tightening her expression. "Get to the emergency stabilizer console," he ordered. "You can manually recalibrate the flight controls from there." She hesitated. "You'll be defenseless." "Go," he snapped. "I'll keep them off us." Without another word, Zyra bolted from the cockpit, her footsteps echoing down the narrow corridor. Elias gritted his teeth and spun the ship into a desperate corkscrew maneuver, narrowly avoiding another volley of plasma fire. Every second stretched into eternity as he waited for her signal, praying she could hold the ship together just a little longer. Suddenly, static crackled through the comms. "Stabilizers online." Zyra's voice cut through the chaos. Elias surged forward, slamming the flight stick into a hard dive toward the densest part of the debris field. The pirate ship hesitated, unwilling to risk following them through the dangerous wreckage. He exhaled a shaky breath as the hostile ship peeled away, leaving the Wayfinder drifting in eerie silence among the dead hulks of forgotten starships. "Zyra, report," he barked into the comms. No response. His heart pounded as he scrambled from the cockpit, sprinting toward the maintenance bay. His boots echoed against the cold metal floor as dread coiled tighter in his chest. He found her slumped against the stabilizer console, her bioluminescent markings dimmed to a faint, pulsing glow. Blood stained her sleeve where jagged debris had sliced through her arm. "Zyra!" Elias dropped to his knees, gathering her trembling form into his arms. Her eyes fluttered open at his touch, hazy but aware. "You did it," she whispered, her voice weak but steady. He pressed his forehead against hers, his breath shuddering with relief. "You saved us." Her trembling fingers brushed his jaw, tracing the lines of tension etched into his face. "I couldn't let you fight alone." His grip tightened around her, fierce and protective. "You'll never have to." For a long moment, they stayed locked together, breathing, alive, holding on like they might vanish into the dark if they let go. The ship's stabilizers hummed faintly in the background, a quiet reminder that, against all odds, they had survived. Together, the emergency lights in the Wayfinder flickered softly as Elias guided Zyra to the small medical bay. Her breathing was shallow but steady, her bioluminescent markings dimmed to a faint shimmer, pulsing weakly along her arms. The makeshift cot creaked under her slight weight as he carefully laid her down. "You're going to be fine," he muttered, more to himself than to her. His hands shook as he rummaged through the medical supplies, finding disinfectant and bandages. He'd been through worse, seen worse, but the sight of her pale, trembling form filled him with a helplessness he couldn't stand. Zyra stirred as he knelt beside her, her eyes fluttering open, hazy but aware. "Elias, you stayed." His chest ached at the quiet vulnerability in her voice. "Of course I stayed. Where else would I be?" She managed a faint, tired smile, her fingers twitching weakly toward him before falling back against the cot. He caught her hand gently, enclosing her slender fingers in his calloused grip. "I need to clean this," he said quietly, nodding toward the deep gash on her upper arm. "It's going to sting." Zyra's eyes softened with trust. "I'm not afraid." With steady hands, Elias cleaned the wound, applying gentle pressure to stem the bleeding. She hissed softly but didn't flinch, her gaze never leaving his face. His fingers brushed over the glowing lines tracing her wrist, feeling the faint pulse beneath her skin, a fragile heartbeat reminding him just how close he'd come to losing her. "You're stubborn," he muttered, voice rough with suppressed emotion. "Rushing into danger like that." Her lips curved faintly. "I learned from the best." He let out a shaky breath, taping the bandages securely. "You scared the hell out of me. I'm still here," she whispered, squeezing his hand weakly. "Thanks to you." Elias exhaled, brushing damp hair back from her forehead, letting his fingers linger longer than he should. Her skin was still warm beneath his touch, her markings dim but steady. "You rest now," he ordered gently. "We'll talk later." Her fingers tightened on his, reluctant to let go. "Stay, please." For a moment he hesitated, but only for a moment. With quiet resolve, he kicked off his boots and settled on the edge of the cot, careful not to jostle her injured arm. Zyra shifted toward him instinctively, curling into his side as though seeking comfort she couldn't voice aloud. Elias wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. Her soft breath brushed against his neck, her fragile warmth pressing into his chest. He rested his chin gently against her hair, breathing in the faint, soothing scent that clung to her. Something floral and faintly electric, like rain before a storm. For the first time in years, he let himself relax, truly relax, as her steady breathing lulled him into something dangerously close to peace. Hours passed. The soft hum of the ship's repaired stabilizers blended with the even rhythm of Zyra's breathing. Elias woke slowly, disoriented at first, until he felt her curled against him, her slender fingers still resting lightly against his chest. He tensed, fighting the surge of protectiveness tightening in his chest. His gaze drifted down to her sleeping face, peaceful, her glowing markings faint but steady, her expression free of the worry she so often wore. She looked at ease. Against his better judgment, his hand drifted lower, tracing the edge of her wrist where her pulse glimmered beneath her skin. His touch must have stirred her, because her breath hitched softly, her lashes fluttering open. Their eyes met, startled at first, then softening with recognition. "Elias," she whispered, her voice thick with sleep. "You should still be resting," he murmured, brushing his thumb gently over her wrist. "I couldn't." Her fingers curled around his hand, holding him there. "You were warm." His chest tightened at the quiet vulnerability in her voice. He shifted, sitting up slightly but keeping her securely tucked against his side. "You scared me out there," he admitted, voice rough. "I thought I'd lost you." Zyra's gaze softened, her fingers tracing slow, trembling patterns over the fabric of his shirt. "I couldn't let you fight alone." His breath hitched as her touch lingered, warm and familiar. "You don't have to protect me, Zyra, but I want to." Her markings flared faintly as she spoke, shimmering with quiet intensity. Before he could respond, her fingers brushed higher, tracing the edge of his jaw with deliberate tenderness. Her touch sent a shiver through him, not just from the electric warmth of her skin, but from the sheer intimacy behind it. No words, no pretense, just connection. Elias cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing across her cheek. Her breath caught, her lips parting softly as his gaze locked on hers, searching for any sign of hesitation. Deliberately, he leaned in, letting his forehead rest against hers. Her fingers tightened in his shirt, pulling him closer. Their lips met in a slow, searching kiss, tentative, almost fragile, but deepening with every second that passed. Her markings pulsed brighter with each shared breath, each lingering touch, casting faint light across the dimly lit medical bay. Elias groaned softly, letting himself fall into the moment, letting himself feel without fear or restraint. Zyra melted into him, her hands curling into his shoulders as though anchoring herself to something solid, something real. When they finally broke apart, breathless and trembling, she rested her forehead against his, eyes still shimmering with residual light. "I'm still here," she whispered, her voice steady but soft. Elias pressed another gentle kiss to her brow, letting his lips linger. "So am I." For the first time in longer than he could remember, he allowed himself to believe it. The ship's engine hummed softly as the Wayfinder drifted through quiet space, its systems stabilized after the near-deadly encounter with the pirate vessel. Elias paced the narrow corridor outside the medical bay, still running through the endless repairs in his head, though his mind stubbornly refused to let go of something far more pressing. Zyra. She was healing, though slower than he liked. Her species' regenerative abilities were impressive, but exhaustion had taken its toll. He checked on her more times than he cared to admit, each visit stretching longer than the last. Every glance, every faint glow of her bioluminescent skin stirred something protective and primal in him, something he couldn't deny any longer. With a deep breath, he rapped lightly on the edge of the open medical bay door. "You awake?" Inside, Zyra sat perched on the edge of the cot, her bandaged arm resting in her lap. Her markings pulsed gently in time with her heartbeat, casting faint light across the darkened room. "I can't seem to rest," she admitted softly, offering a small, weary smile. "Too many thoughts." Elias stepped inside, letting the door slide shut behind him. "Mind if I join you?" Her expression warmed. "I'd like that." He settled into the seat across from her, his elbows resting on his knees. Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but charged with something deeper. He could feel her gaze on him, thoughtful and searching. "You seem troubled," she murmured, tilting her head. "Are you still thinking about the pirates?" He shook his head. "No, it's not that." He hesitated, searching for the right words. "I keep thinking about what could have happened if we hadn't made it out." Her expression softened, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of her bandage. "But we did. Because of you," he said quietly, his voice rough with sincerity. "You put yourself in danger without a second thought. I couldn't let you face it alone." Her voice trembled just slightly, her glowing fingers curling in her lap. "I'm not used to carrying this much." The weight behind her words hit him like a blow. He reached out before he could second-guess himself, covering her hand with his. Her skin was warm, pulsing faintly beneath his calloused fingers. "I'm not either," he admitted, holding her gaze. "But it's real. Whatever this is." Zyra's breath hitched, her fingers tightening around his. "It feels so much. I don't know how to keep it inside." "Then don't." His voice dropped, rough with something deeper, something he could no longer suppress. "I'm right here." For a long, breathless moment, she held his gaze, her luminous eyes shimmering with quiet intensity. Slowly, she lifted her free hand, tracing tentative fingers along the edge of his jaw. Her touch was soft, exploratory, like she was learning every line, every scar. Elias exhaled sharply, letting himself lean into her touch. His hand rose to cradle her wrist, feeling the steady pulse beneath her skin. "I'm not afraid of you," he murmured, his voice low and steady. Her markings flared brighter, their soft glow washing over both of them. "I've never let anyone this close before. You're not the only one." His thumb brushed across her knuckles, grounding them both. Their foreheads rested together, breath mingling in the quiet. Her fingers slipped down to his collar, curling into the worn fabric of his shirt as though anchoring herself. His hands slid to her waist, steady but gentle, holding her like she might disappear if he let go. Slowly, hesitantly, their lips met, soft and searching, a silent question neither had dared to voice until now. Her breath trembled as she leaned in further, deepening the kiss with quiet, desperate intensity. Elias groaned softly, letting his arms circle her fully, pulling her into his lap without thinking. She gasped but didn't pull away, her glowing fingers threading through his hair, as though she couldn't bear to lose contact. Her markings pulsed in rhythmic waves, responding to every brush of his lips, every lingering touch. He could feel the heat radiating from her skin, not just warmth but something deeper, something electric and alive. When they finally broke apart, breathless and trembling, Zyra's forehead rested against his, her fingers still buried in his shirt. "I feel everything when I'm near you," she whispered, her voice unsteady but sure. "It's overwhelming, but I don't want it to stop." Elias cupped her face, his thumbs brushing gently over her cheeks. "Then we don't stop." Her lips curved faintly, though her eyes shimmered with emotion. She pressed a soft, lingering kiss to his palm, letting her bioluminescence flare brighter in quiet, wordless acceptance. In that moment, nothing outside the ship mattered. No past, no future, only the fragile, undeniable connection pulsing between them. For the first time in longer than either could remember, they weren't alone. And that was everything. The following days on the Wayfinder passed in a tense, fragile quiet. Elias and Zyra fell into their usual routines, but something had shifted, something neither could ignore. They worked side by side in familiar rhythm, but the charged connection between them lingered just beneath the surface, an unspoken undercurrent neither could escape. Elias couldn't stop thinking about that night in the medical bay, the warmth of her skin beneath his hands, the way her breath hitched when he touched her, how her bioluminescent markings had pulsed brighter with every shared heartbeat. It felt as if something fundamental between them had changed, something raw and real, but he didn't know how to face it without risking everything. Zyra was no better. She still felt his touch, even when he was across the room. His steady presence anchored her in ways she'd never experienced before, making it harder and harder to maintain the guarded distance she'd once relied on. But with each passing day, she felt the pull growing stronger, impossible to deny. The breaking point came during a quiet maintenance check in the ship's engine room. The power relays needed recalibrating, requiring both of them to work in tight, confined quarters beneath the flickering control panels. The low hum of the engines reverberated around them, blending with the sound of Elias's measured breathing as he worked only inches away. "Hand me the plasma spanner," Elias said, his voice rough but steady. Zyra reached for the tool, but her fingers brushed his in the confined space, sending a jolt of familiar warmth through her skin. She froze, her gaze snapping up to meet his. His hand lingered against hers for a moment too long before he reluctantly pulled back. "Sorry," she whispered, though her voice trembled. Elias exhaled sharply, setting the tool aside. "You don't have to apologize." Their eyes met, the space between them charged with unresolved tension. Zyra's markings flared faintly, betraying the emotions she couldn't suppress, even when she tried. "We can't keep pretending this isn't happening," she said quietly, her fingers curling into her palms. Elias scrubbed a hand down his face, the weight of her words hitting hard. "I know." Silence stretched, filled only by the distant hum of the engines. He could see the uncertainty in her eyes, the conflict mirrored in his own. Every instinct told him to step back, to push her away for her own safety, but he couldn't force himself to do it. "Not anymore." "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Of what this means. Of losing control." His chest tightened at the raw honesty in her voice. Slowly, carefully, he closed the space between them, resting his hands gently on her shoulders. Her breath hitched, but she didn't pull away. "You're not alone in this," he said softly, his voice low but steady. "Whatever happens, we figure it out together." Her luminous eyes shimmered with unshed emotion. "But what if it's too much? Then we take it one step at a time." His hands slid down her arms, his touch steady and grounding. "You don't have to do this alone. Not anymore." For a long, breathless moment, she searched his face, looking for doubt or hesitation, but found none. Slowly, she lifted her hand and traced tentative fingers along his jaw, her touch featherlight but steady. "I don't want to push you away," he murmured, she whispered, his hand covering hers, holding it gently against his cheek. The charged stillness between them shattered as she surged forward, her lips brushing his in a tentative, searching kiss. He responded instantly, his arms wrapping around her, pulling her closer with quiet desperation. Her bioluminescent markings flared brighter, pulsing in time with her racing heartbeat. Their kiss deepened, slow but intense, every shared breath igniting something far deeper than either could deny. Zyra's fingers curled into the front of his shirt, anchoring herself as though afraid he might vanish if she let go. When they finally broke apart, breathless and trembling, she rested her forehead against his, her eyes still glowing faintly. "I don't know how to stop feeling this," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. Elias pressed another soft kiss to her temple, holding her close. "Then don't. I'm right here." Her hands tightened on his arms, grounding herself in his steady presence. For the first time, she let herself believe it, let herself trust that he wouldn't let go. Neither of them spoke as they held onto each other in the quiet stillness of the engine room. No words were needed. Everything that mattered had already been said in the way they touched, the way they held on despite everything. For now, that was enough. The stars stretched endlessly beyond the thick viewport of the Wayfinder, cold and distant as ever. But inside the ship, Elias and Zyra stood locked in a fragile stillness. Days after their shared moment in the engine room, the air between them had settled into something quiet but unmistakably intense. A connection neither could deny but both struggled to define. They spoke less now, though not from discomfort. Their touches said more than words ever could. Fingers brushing when passing tools, lingering glances that stretched seconds longer than they should. A quiet presence shared in the stillness of the ship. It was enough for now, but the universe had never been kind to dreamers. The proximity alarm blared subtly, shattering the fragile peace. Elias bolted from his chair, adrenaline surging as he rushed to the cockpit with Zyra right behind him. "Report," he barked, sliding into the pilot seat and scanning the flickering monitor. His heart sank as the external sensors displayed a dark, predatory silhouette closing in fast. "It's them." Zyra's voice trembled with recognition. The same pirate ship from before. Elias cursed, flipping on the ship's limited defensive systems. They must have tracked our last jump. They're hailing us, Zyra said, her bioluminescent markings dimming with tension. He clenched his jaw. Ignore it. The comm crackled to life regardless, spilling harsh, guttural voices through the cockpit speakers. The message was clear. Surrender or die. They're charging weapons, Zyra warned, her fingers flying across the console. Before she could finish, a deafening blast struck the ship, sending the Wayfinder spinning violently. Elias gritted his teeth as he wrestled the controls, barely managing to stabilize their flight path. Shields at 30%, Zyra shouted. They're not giving us a choice. His voice was grim. Prepare for emergency evasive maneuvers. Another blast rocked the ship, sparks showering down as a secondary console exploded. Smoke filled the air, thick and choking. We can't outrun them, Zyra coughed, shielding her face from the burning smoke. Elias's mind raced, calculating their few remaining options. Running wasn't possible, but fighting meant certain death. There was only one move left. Get to the escape pod, he ordered. Zyra froze. What? You heard me. His voice cracked with urgency. I'll draw them away. You have to go. No. She surged forward, grabbing his arm. Her grip was fierce, trembling with emotion. I'm not leaving you. You have to. His eyes blazed with desperation. If they board this ship, I know what they'll do, she shouted, her markings flaring brightly. But I'm not abandoning you. Their breaths came fast and ragged, the ship's alarms screaming around them, but neither moved. Zyra's fingers tightened on his sleeve, her eyes burning with defiant resolve. If we go down together, she whispered, her voice steady despite the fear glimmering beneath it. Elias cursed under his breath, torn between anger and something far more painful, raw, helpless love. He grabbed her shoulders, holding her tightly as though it might shield her from what was coming. Then we fight, he said, his voice low but resolute. Zyra nodded, her jaw set with fierce determination. They moved in sync, locking down the ship's critical systems and activating every remaining defense protocol the Wayfinder had left. The pirate ship loomed closer, its weapons charging for a final, fatal blow. Target their main reactor, Elias ordered, locking the ship's limited cannons onto the enemy vessel. We only get one shot. Zyra's fingers flew across the targeting console, locking in the firing sequence. Ready. His hand hovered over the launch trigger, but before he could press it, the enemy ship fired first. The blast struck home. The Wayfinder buckled under the impact, its hull groaning in protest. Elias was thrown from his seat, pain lancing through his ribs as he hit the cold, unforgiving floor. The world blurred into chaos. Flashing lights, distant alarms, the sharp tang of burning metal. Then, through the haze he heard her voice. Elias! Zyra's frantic hands were on him, pulling him upright despite her own injuries. I'm fine, he gasped, though every breath burned. Did we? She shook her head, tears shimmering in her luminous eyes. The reactor's still active. We failed. He clenched his fists, teeth grinding against the helplessness clawing at his chest. They were out of time, out of options, out of hope. Before he could speak, Zyra cupped his face, her glowing hands trembling against his skin. There's one last thing I can do. His breath hitched. Zyra, no. Her markings flared brighter, burning with fierce intensity. If I can reach their minds, I can make them believe we're already dead. It'll only last a moment, but it might be enough. No, his grip tightened on her wrists. You'll burn yourself out. You could. There's no other way. Her voice cracked, but her resolve didn't waver. Please, let me save you. His heart clenched, torn between desperation and unbearable fear. He wanted to refuse, wanted to hold her back, keep her safe, but he knew better. She would never stop fighting for him, just as he couldn't stop fighting for her. "I'm with you," he whispered, resting his forehead against hers. "Always." A tear slipped down her cheek, shimmering like liquid starlight. She pressed one last, lingering kiss to his lips, soft, desperate, filled with everything they couldn't say. Then she turned, stepping into the light, and let it consume her. The world around Elias dissolved into white-hot light as Zyra stepped forward, her luminous skin flaring with an intensity he'd never seen before. Waves of raw, pulsing energy radiated from her, lighting the darkened cockpit of the Wayfinder like a living star. He tried to move to reach for her, but an unseen force rooted him in place. The air buzzed with static, shimmering with the power she wielded, the kind of power that could break minds or burn her alive if she pushed too far. "Zyra!" His voice cracked with desperation, fear clawing at his chest. She turned, her glowing eyes locking onto his. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice echoing with something otherworldly, something far greater than herself. "Don't let go." Before he could respond, she raised her hands, palms glowing like twin suns, and thrust them outward. A tidal wave of shimmering energy exploded from her fingertips, surging across the collapsing bridge and crashing into the pirate ship like a living storm. For a breathless moment, time seemed frozen. The enemy ship's weapons flickered and died, its systems falling dark as Zyra's will crashed against theirs like a relentless tide. Elias could feel her presence stretching outward, her mind connecting to the hostile crew, warping reality itself, weaving a tapestry of false memories and sensory confusion. Through their shared link, he felt her burning determination, her fierce refusal to let him die, her overwhelming love forged in shared struggles and silent promises. She was giving everything, and it was tearing her apart. "No, come back." He surged forward, breaking free of the invisible pull keeping him still. His boots pounded against the trembling floor as he reached her just as her knees buckled, the light around her flickering dangerously. He caught her in his arms, collapsing to the floor with her cradled against his chest. Her trembling fingers clutched at his shirt, "I did it," her breath coming in shallow gasps, her voice fragile and distant. "They're gone." Through the viewport, the pirate ship drifted lifelessly into the void, powerless and fading into the distant dark. They were safe, for now, but Zyra was fading too. "Stay with me," Elias pleaded, pressing his forehead against hers. His hands cradled her face, desperately grounding her in the present, in him. "Don't you dare let go." Her markings flickered weakly, pulsing in time with her slowing heartbeat. I'm still here," she whispered, though her voice trembled with exhaustion. His breath shuddered, torn between relief and unbearable fear. You can't leave me. I'm not going anywhere." Her fingers traced his jaw, faint but steady. "I feel you." He crushed her closer, his lips brushing her temple, her cheek, anywhere he could reach. His chest ached with helpless love, fierce and all-consuming. He couldn't lose her, not after everything, not now. With a shaky breath, he pressed his lips to hers, soft, desperate, real. Her pulse surged faintly beneath his hands, responding to the intensity of his touch, grounding her in the present. The faint, familiar warmth of her bioluminescence flared gently, faint but alive. "I'm here," she breathed against his mouth, her fingers curling into his shirt with quiet strength. "I found you." His forehead rested against hers, tears slipping down his face, though he didn't care. "I've got you," he promised, his voice raw but steady. "I'm not letting go." They stayed locked together, breathing in shared stillness as the ship's systems slowly stabilized around them. The distant hum of the repaired engines whispered faintly through the cracked hull, a fragile reminder that they were still alive, that she was still alive. After what felt like eternity, Zyra stirred, her glowing eyes shimmering faintly beneath heavy lids. "The ship? We need to check." "Forget the ship." Elias's voice was firm but gentle, his hands steady against her trembling shoulders. "We're safe." You are the reason we're safe. Her lips curved into a faint, exhausted smile. You're stubborn. His breath hitched, a quiet laugh breaking through the lingering ache in his chest. You've got no idea. He pressed another lingering kiss to her brow, letting his lips rest against her soft, warm skin. Her glowing fingers brushed his jaw, slow and steady, grounding them both in the quiet, shared intimacy of the moment. We're really okay? She whispered, still disbelieving. Elias nodded, his voice soft but resolute. We made it. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Zaira let herself believe it. She let herself feel not just the lingering ache of exhaustion, but the quiet, undeniable presence of the man holding her as though she were the only thing keeping him anchored to the universe. Her fingers tightened around his, steady and sure. Then I'm not letting go either. They stayed locked together as the stars stretched endlessly beyond the viewport. Cold and distant, but no longer empty. Not anymore.